Thanks, Daryl. I wonder, that was after the World Cup, right? That Argentina won. I wonder what the data looked like before. Must have been worse, right? Thank you so much. And I'm going to spend a little bit of time, not that much, talking about U.S. public opinion as it relates to the Ukraine. But before I do that, I just want to sum up, the state of America today, the mood of American relationship to the Ukraine. I would call it tepid support for the status quo. And you're going to see that in the data. It's very clear, I believe, and we'll come back around and we'll show that. And before we go into the specifics of actually polling data, I want to provide some context because we are talking about public opinion, and one might ask, why does it matter at all? And for us to talk about public opinion in the context of a conflict, in the context of policy. And here I'm showing you a meta-analysis that is a combination of many studies and data points, looking at hundreds of different events and bills and outcomes, and its relationship to public opinion. And what do we see? There's a convergence, right, between public opinion and outcomes. The strongest relationship, obviously, is with elections, which makes total sense. That's when public opinion typically is most focused on what leaders are doing, what governments are doing, what politicians and parties are doing. In second place, it's domestic policy, kind of meat and potatoes issues. Those are the things we worry about. I'm worried about having a job or putting food on the table for my children. I'm worried about my health and my safety. It makes total sense. And in third place, still 50%. There's a kind of an overlap. It's still strong, but it's in third place is foreign policy. Foreign policy is always the weakest. It's always the most attenuated, that is, outcomes correlated or associated with public opinion. And the question is why? Well, because typically foreign policy events that are happening in other places are very distant, as Daryl was saying. Right? There's a proximity issue. They're not very close. Typically, at least in the United States, they're not so existential, right? But also you have policy elites mediating the relationship. It's suggestive that elites like individuals in this room, think tanks in DC, and other associated institutions and organizations have a lot of impact on what happens independent of public opinion. And that's something we should just keep in consideration, take in consideration when we look at the data. Obviously, an administration, a government wants to be aligned as well as they can be with public opinion, but it's not a necessary condition when it comes to foreign policy. So let's jump into the data. Here's just a trend line of concern for wars and foreign conflicts over time since 2012. Obviously, if we had this in 2008 or 2007 or 2006, it would be the #1 issue. It would be up there in the 20s and 30s and 40s. This is sort of post 9/11 regime, let's call it. And we see moments here and there, as Daryl was saying, terrorist attacks kind of push our concerns up and down. But people that is Americans, were very concerned about the conflict in the Ukraine last year. Everyone was focused on it. Everyone was paying attention to their mobile phone. Everyone was reading the newspaper or watching TV. And for a moment, Americans were concerned, right? And let's keep that in mind. So typically wars and conflicts are distant. They're not proximate, as I was saying before. They're not as important. But for moments in time, they can be. The one additional point I wanted to sort of share here, Daryl showed as well main problems questions. This comes from a main problems question. Indeed, it comes from a large battery of items. And actually, in the United States today, the #1 issue is inflation or the economy, depending on how you frame it. Foreign policy is a tertiary, secondary issue that's further down. Like I said, it can pop up once in a while, and it sort of reverts back to status quo ante. If I had one question as a professional pollster, one question on my poll would be this question. What are the main concerns or problems in the country today? And the question is why? Because it's very, very predictive of policy and outcomes, right? And what do we know? We know, based upon our own research, our own studies, that 85% of all elections are won by the candidate that's strongest on the main issue. right? If you're going to win an election, you're not going to really want to talk about foreign policy and war. Maybe it's a secondary issue or tertiary issue. It's not the primary one. The point I want to make here is, getting the conflict totally wrong might penalize the administration. There's precedent for that. There's data that suggests that in the past, right? But just being lukewarm on it, sort of convergent with it, really doesn't penalize the Biden administration given the importance today. And I'll come back and I'll talk about that. So just to reinforce the proximity issue, it's not really a high concern. Maybe when it first happened, it was a concern for Americans. It was a worry that Americans had. Then it's just sort of reverted back to status quo ante. I just wanted to show two additional data points to show that spike. One is just Google mentions. Think of all of us looking at our mobile phones, as I was saying, looking at the TV, looking at CNN. We were watching it. We were fixated by it at the beginning, and then it just sort of passed into our memories as we focused on more pressing issues like how to make ends meet, right, ultimately. And the other one is gas prices. That's another way you can think of linkage. To what extent is it proximate to you? Well, it's proximate to me if it hits my pocketbook. There was a momentary impact of that, and once again, that sort of reverted back, back to status quo ante, even a little bit better for Americans today. So it's a very distant issue. That's the point I wanted to make, right? Doesn't mean it isn't an important issue and that public opinion doesn't have opinions on it, but for them, there are other priorities, per Daryl's point. So here is just looking at to what extent they support it. And there's no such thing as one ballot question to ask, do you support the conflict or support for the conflict in the Ukraine? It's what I call a series of conditions. There's conditionality, right? There's some things that Americans support. There are some things that Americans don't support. There's a rank ordering of them, right? On the one hand, it's like Americans are in favor of support, economic assistance, even military materiel to Ukraine. On the other hand, they're not in support of putting troops there. By the way, this rank order has been consistent over time since the beginning of the conflict. There's been no change of it specifically. And really, this is the status quo, right? Public opinion and policy are aligned when it comes to the status quo, which is we are helping Ukraine, that is, the United States is helping Ukraine on issues of economic assistance and materiel, but we aren't putting troops on the ground or using no-fly zones. Again, I think the data is very clear. The question is, when you throw in the issue of nuclear, the threats that are coming out of Russia today, actually there were a few yesterday, if you look more specifically, the president of the Duma threatened again. What happens? Do Americans back off? Actually, no, they double down and there's more support. So there's what we would call maybe a slight rally around the flag effect. Americans feel threatened if Russia threatens with weapons of mass destruction, or more specifically, nuclear war. So once again, the status quo is not to put anything there, that is in men or materials in the Ukraine, all in favor of different sorts of assistance. However, they won't be bullied around. American public opinion reacts to Russian threats of weapons of mass destruction and of a nuclear nature, okay? When you look at this over time, I just want to give a trend on it. Is it flatline? Not quite. The rank ordering is the same. That is what Americans support and what Americans don't support. But there is some attenuation over time. I would say as it's passed into the memory of Americans, it's become more political, more politicized. We even could look at the midterms as one of those catalysts, those important sort of points of time when the war in Ukraine became part of the political debate, right? And we can see that on average there's an attenuation that is of support. Here I'm looking specifically at material, war material, and other sorts of forms of military aid, and especially among Republicans. So just once again, it's become, in part at least, a partisan issue. What that means specifically from a policy perspective, will there just be more oversight? Will there be curbing of spending? That's another question, right? Not a question for me. But from a public opinion standpoint, there has been this attenuation. But as I said at the beginning, there's still tepid and consistent support for supporting Ukraine here in the United States. And the last point I want to make is just about credible messengers, like who's credible, who's not in the United States, at least when it respect to public opinion. By the way, this is a softball, this was an easy one, right? I mean, Ukraine and European Union, great allies, China and Russia, no. I don't think that should surprise anyone, but it is pretty, striking the distance between those that are credible and those that aren't. I mean, it's like two sides of the, I don't even know if it's two sides of the same coin, it's like two Legos, right, that kind of go together, like they're completely, something like that. And on the other side, just looking at favorability, we have Zelensky, the president, extremely favorable, and on the flip side, Putin, Xi Jinping, like on the other side of the Lego, I guess, right? But that's the credibility landscape here in the United States. In other words, the Ukraine has extreme credibility at this point. The president Zelensky has extreme credibility at this point, at least to mold the Ukraine's message in the Beltway and more broadly in the United States. So in sum, I want to be short and sweet to hand it over to my colleague Irina to really talk about some cool data out of the Ukraine. Here in the United States, there's tepid support for the Ukraine, for the status quo. There's a link between, obviously, public opinion and outcomes. It's weaker when it comes to foreign policy that allows policy elites to have more room to operate, but I think in some ways probably is a good thing if I want to throw in a value judgment there. There's a rank ordering of what Americans are willing to support, what they're not. That follows the status quo. It hasn't changed much, that is the rank ordering, but there's been some sort of attenuation. And lastly, just to reinforce the last point that I made, the Ukraine and President Zelensky are extremely credible at this point in the United States. And with that, I hand it over to Irina.